Mai ki tēnei hui. Thank you all for joining us here today. This has been acutely awaited, and people that worked with me last term know how much of a focus there was around Te Mahana and our homelessness strategy, so really excited to have this workshop here today. Welcome David and the team. We have allocated an hour for this workshop, and yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. I've met all of you. My name is David. I'm the Connected Communities Manager, and I just wanted to introduce you to Amy Bird, who will be familiar to many of you. She is our harm reduction team leader, and this is Joe Cook, who is one of our harm reduction advisors. Both Joe and Amy have worked really closely at an operational level with all of the organisations who support homelessness response in the city. You might notice that we're just here by ourselves, and the reason for that, rather than bringing in our partners again like the City Mission and DCM, is that we all saw them just on Tuesday. They're really busy people, and we thought, that would let them get back to doing what they're doing. So you will have seen the slides. There are quite a few of them, and I apologise for that, but this is a really complex issue, and there is a lot of information to kind of go through and digest. So I'll do quite a bit of talking, hopefully not too much at the start, and then really keen to have a conversation and answer any questions that you might have following that, if that is okay. I thought at the start it would be helpful to just go through and remind us all of the definition we use for homelessness, and we currently define homelessness as living situations where people have no other options to acquire safe and secure housing. It's much broader than just rough sleeping and includes things like couch surfing, living in vehicles, staying in temporary accommodation like emergency and transitional housing, and living in overcrowded or uninhabitable buildings. In terms of data, we have some good information around things like rough sleeping, and we monitor reports from the public we know about people living in emergency and transitional housing, as well as who is on the public housing register. But we don't currently have an effective or regular way to monitor the numbers of people who are living in uninhabitable and overcrowded homes. Homelessness, it's important right at the outset to recognise the impact that homelessness has on the individuals who it affects, as well as on the city and the wider community. Homelessness has significant negative impacts on well-being, as some groups are at particular risk of becoming homelessness or experiencing chronic homelessness. The negative long-term effects on children and young people of extended stays in emergency housing and motels is especially concerning. We are, and some positive news, we are seeing a decline in the number of children in households receiving emergency housing special needs grants. So that dropped from 138 to 57, still too high between March and December 2022, but there is still a significant issue with the extended length of stay in emergency accommodation. Periods of rough sleeping have a dramatic impact on the safety and well-being of people who already face multiple challenges and transitions. And those transition times, for example, exiting prison, medical or state care, are times where people are most at risk of becoming homeless. People with high and complex needs increasingly represent the majority of the long-term rough sleepers we see in Wellington, and their safety, their mental and their physical health is already concerning and is made even worse and further compromised by the homelessness experience. So if we think about who is experiencing homelessness and recognising the limitations on the data that we do have, we try to look across the homelessness spectrum to understand who is experiencing homelessness, and we get a good level of information from DCM around this, and the data that we're sharing here is from reporting that DCM have provided to us around people they've connected through their outreach service. It is no surprise to anyone around this table that Māori are significantly overrepresented in this data, representing an average of 50% of the taumai who engage with DCM. And taumai, if you're not aware, is the name used by DCM to refer to the people that they work with. People who identify as male are also overrepresented, averaging around 79%. Most Tomai engaged with by DCM are in the 25 to 54 age range, with the largest group consistently being people in the 35 to 39 age range, with the biggest growth, though, in the 25 to 29 group, followed by 55 to 59. That outreach data, though, like I mentioned, it really has an emphasis on rough sleeping, so it doesn't reflect the extent of homelessness in a number of groups and communities. Women and rainbow communities are more distributed across the spectrum of homelessness than those who are rough sleeping. Women are estimated to represent 50% of the population across the spectrum of homelessness, and young people experience disproportionately high rates of homelessness. Nationally, 20 to 40% of people who are experiencing homelessness across the spectrum from rough sleeping through to couch surfing are estimated to be from rainbow communities. The key drivers of homelessness, there is the obvious one around supply and the lack of affordable and suitable housing in the city. Unmet need in areas including mental health and addiction are an ongoing challenge, as well as social structures including trauma, poverty, and the many impacts of colonisation on Māori. These drivers, as you are aware, are really complex, and the majority of them are well beyond Council's direct control, but we do have an important role to play in preventing and addressing homelessness. We provide affordable housing, we shape supply of housing through mechanisms including the district plan. We invest in homelessness programs and initiatives, provide an operational and tactical response, and facilitate and improve system response, including addressing gaps. I'm not going to focus through this presentation on the provision of affordable housing or shaping supply. Yeah. And instead I'll focus on the areas that are that my team have involvement in. So funding programs and initiatives, the recent funding has supported a sort of outreach approach as well as tenancy support. Those are both delivered by DCM. We've funded around $1 million to support the redevelopment of what is now, will shortly be Te Pāmaru by the City Mission, which will provide 18 emergency and transitional accommodation places, including, last year, Council U agreed to remit development contributions for Whakamaru, another City Mission redevelopment. Now, total investment in recent years includes funding to other key partners, including Women's Refuge, Te Whare Rokiroki, Community Law, Kahungunu Whānau Services, and others. Our operational and tactical response to homelessness is coordinated by the Council. We work in conjunction with DCM's assertive outreach response and our internal teams, including Hāpai Ake, who engage with and assist people in Wellington who are experiencing homelessness and people begging on the street. Begging is often mistaken for rough sleeping, and it's important for me to share, to digress very briefly to talk about begging and to make it clear that we have all of the tools that we need to respond appropriately to begging. Many of the people who beg and are not homeless, our team engage proactively in an attempt to identify support needs that people might have and to connect them to support services. Some of you might know that in the past we have encouraged and done kind of promotional campaigns encouraging people to support organisations who support people who are struggling rather than directly to people who beg, but Wellingtonians and visitors to Wellingtonians are very generous, and that does mean that at times begging can be a lucrative for some people. One of the things we're doing around facilitating an improved system response is developing our system governance model. That was a really key component to the Te Mahana strategy. So that includes maintaining support for the multidisciplinary team, the officers group, and working to reduce duplications and joining forces actually with some of the other case coordination structures that have emerged in the last couple of years. So one example of those is Te Kākano, which is a group that meets to address people with unmet health needs. So in particular, we've improved our involvement in the areas of mental health and addiction. We're also working, I'll talk more about that one in a slide to come, but we're working with improving the partnership that we have with Mana Whenua on the delivery of housing and homelessness outcomes with a focus on Māori. I think it's important to go back just very briefly to the Te Mahana strategy, which was a very public and very successful approach, and that was around a collaborative approach to making significant progress towards ending homelessness in Wellington. That formal strategy has come to an end in 2020, but our relationships at a strategic and operational level with all of the groups involved in that approach are still very strong. There has been an increase, through that period in things like the supply of social and affordable housing, as well as a greater range of support and products available to people. But as we all know, homelessness continues to present as a really significant challenge. Just to provide a brief overview of how the landscape, I suppose, landscape is probably not the right word, but has changed in recent years, and the importance of evolving our approach. Since Te Mahana was established, there has been a significant increase in the supply of social housing in the city. I remember in my previous role at MSD coming to Te Mahana meetings and talking about how important housing first was at the time, and now we have significant numbers of housing first places in Wellington. We have increasing numbers of transitional housing. The emergency housing special needs grant is a thing now, although it comes with its own set of challenges. Housing support products that support people to move from temporary accommodation into permanent housing, plus the sustaining tenancy services that are funded by both central government as well as the City Council. And there is, as we all know, more innovative housing support services coming to the city, including supported housing in Rolleston Street and Arlington, which are Kainga Order developments, and Te Pāmaru coming very soon. The way we have invested in our response to homelessness has evolved over time, and that was initially a joint proposal that involved DCM, Kahungunu Whānau Services, and the Soup Kitchen to provide case coordination, street outreach, and a tenancy advocacy service. But there were some challenges with the reporting for that approach. More recent funding has supported the assertive outreach approach for people sleeping rough alongside tenancy support. Te Pāmaru, and this is a copy, sorry. This is the right slide. And redevelopment of the night shelter, our investment into tenancy advocacy support through Wellington Community Law, and they're ongoing multi-year contracts, and we've also provided other ad hoc funding to groups including Kahungunu Whānau Services to support women's homelessness, and more recently to the Soup Kitchen. Our Hāpai Ake service, as well as Te Wahi a Whina down on Manor Street, are really focused on building relationships with individuals and connecting people to services. But there are definitely gaps in the current funding that we provide, and direct and ongoing funding to Kaupapa Māori and iwi social services is an obvious gap in our current provision. It's actually really hard to point to any data that shows that our investment is making a direct impact in reducing homelessness in the city, and we need to do a bit of work to, do some real thought around whether we're measuring the right things, and are we investing in the right place. That more than $1 million investment we know is really important, and it achieves some really strong outcomes for the people who are connected. But when we look at some of the charts that I'll talk you through now, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly where the impact on that investment is having. So On a population basis, Wellington, that orange line is actually Hamilton. It's not Wellington. Yeah. So, but on a population basis, Wellington, like Hamilton, does have a combination of limited affordable housing and high numbers of people who are in emergency accommodation compared with other urban centres. But that downward purple line does show that the number of people in emergency housing is trending downwards in Wellington. Sorry, yes, we're purple.
Yep, purple
Yeah.
line.
Yeah. Good question. I'll come back to you. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah. We're trending, getting closer to the average, and I'll talk through some of it is still a problem in Wellington, and yeah, on the average one is, yeah, and I'll send something through to point it out. That's all good.
Yep.
So this slide is showing the number of transitional housing places and the public housing register. So although the previous slide showed the number of people in emergency accommodation in Wellington was falling, at the same time we have seen an increase in the number of people living in transitional housing. So rather than people moving into permanent housing, there has been a shift from emergency housing to transitional housing, which does come with some really important wraparound support for the people who are in those places. Transitional housing, the average occupancy rate for transitional housing in the city is more than 95%, so it's very highly occupied and there are very few spaces available. We have also seen numbers on the public housing register steadily increase, although that has levelled off recently. As you'll be aware, this is only an indication of demand because there are barriers for people with housing needs getting onto the housing register, and we work actively with the MDT and the officers group to address some of those barriers. Last year, some work was done to compare the council city housing register with the number of people on the MSD housing register, which did identify a number of people who were on one or the other list that could have been eligible for both. There are barriers for people in moving into permanent housing, and that has resulted in extended stays in emergency accommodation, which was intended at its initiation to last for 7 days. But in the December 22 quarter, there were 159 households who had been staying in emergency accommodation for more than 3 months, but only 39 who had been there for less than 3 months. So extended stays in emergency housing is ongoing. This is council data that shows notifications from the public about homelessness, including rough sleeping and people sleeping in cars. So the public contact the council with their concern, and our team or DCM, or we work together, will seek to engage with those people. There are variations and trends in the report. So you can see that there are changes tied to seasonal trends and major events, which can cause problems with reducing the number of emergency housing places available to people, and it does lead to activities including begging increase. Our Hapaiake team complete a regular rough sleeper count, so they literally walk the street very early in the morning to count the number of people that they see who are rough sleeping. There has been a significant change in the period pre and post-COVID, but it is important to note that there are significant limitations with the data. We always use the same route within the CBD and only record visible homelessness. So if somebody is not on that walk or they're not seen, then that isn't recorded. We have started a process last year to engage with mana whenua around better understanding aspirations for how we address homelessness in Wellington. Progress has been challenging. not because of unwillingness on either side. Capacity at both ends has been challenging. This beautiful infographic came out of a hui held last year and outlines the aspirations that came out of that hui. And very briefly, it is primarily around addressing the drivers of homelessness and preventing people from entering the system or returning to the system once they are housed. And we are continuing to, work towards achieving this vision. We are participating actively in the emergency housing system review, which involves the development of a place-based approach for Wellington City, or Wellington Region, I should say. And this the development of a place-based approach for Wellington as well as Hamilton comes from the data I shared earlier, which showed that there were more people staying in emergency housing for longer in Wellington and Hamilton than there are in other regions across the country. This process has involved a number of wānanga. Officers from councils across the region, as well as mana whenua, have participated actively in the process, and at our request, Te Whatu Order have been involved as well, because we really recognise that health challenges is a key driver and a key block on people being able to move into and sustaining housing. There have been some really good potential options come out of these wānanga, and they're ones that we really support. To be honest, the first wānanga we went to, we left feeling really frustrated, like we'd spent an hour talking and that no one was listening, and we started thinking about how we can create our own solution and present it to this group. And we did that involving Taranaki Whānui, and the Wellington City Mission. We had some great ideas. Fortunately, the outcomes of these wānanga have led to exactly the same place. So we've reached a good outcome, and this is around the initiatives that are underway now as part of this process are things like increasing the availability of transitional housing. And transitional housing is really important because it comes with wraparound support for people, 24-hour wraparound support and connection to the services that people need to be successful in sustaining permanent housing. The other key outcomes of that work is around development of additional support to sustain permanent housing. So that is around support provided to people as they transition from emergency accommodation or transitional housing into permanent accommodation. So that's sustaining tenancy type work to address challenges as they arise. Really good, really strong discussion around collective service provision, and this came out of conversations we had around the solutions that were developed for Rotorua, so around a hub-type model, a collective service approach with broad application in terms of the target group, and the intent would be to bring together the right people at the right time, providing wraparound and coordinated support, particularly for people with really complex circumstances. Other groups and other kind of initiatives include mental health triage and providing funding for increased capability and capacity for social services, specifically focused on supporting people with mental health needs, increased mental health capability and capacity. But in the mental health system, workforce capacity is a continued challenge, as well as an increase in mental health and addiction services and potentially funding additional resources to do that, probably as part of the collective service provision. So that could involve something like a cadetship where providers are supported to upskill staff to a level where appropriate service can be provided, as well as providing more support to people who are in transitional housing, more intensive wraparound support to help them on a pathway to transition to permanent housing. I'm nearly there. I'll take a break and then we can answer some questions. But we need to do the work our approach and our investment into homelessness has not changed significantly in recent years, and we've continued to provide the same providers delivering the same services really well, really well, but we need to, I think, review and really understand the impact that our investment has, as well as any gaps that exist, and in particular things like direct support to kaupapa Māori and iwi social service providers. We have not done any significant work to capture the perspectives of people who have experienced homelessness and to understand what would have made a difference for them. Our current funding is funded through the Social and Recreation Fund, and we talked to the grant subcommittee last week about an intention to review kind of the way we fund through that process. And the current funding arrangements that we have with groups like DC and the City Mission and Wellington Community Law currently extend until June 2025. So we have a bit of time to really look into and understand the impact that what we're doing is having, as well as how we can and what should our future approach to responding to homelessness look like. The Housing Action Plan, which includes actions around homelessness, is coming to the Environment and Infrastructure Committee next week, and you might note or feel like it's quite light on actions. It talks through completing our investment in whakamaru and te maru, as well as it talks a bit about these reviews, so reviewing the impact of our investment, capturing voices to determine our future approach. I'm confident that over the next 6 to 12 months, as we do this work, we will need to come back to review and add those key actions to the Housing Action Plan as we understand what that approach should look like. This is a really kind of meaty piece of work that needs to happen to make sure that we are getting the best value and making the most impact that we can with the limited resourcing and funding that we have. Some of the gaps we already know about are things like I mentioned, around Māori youth homelessness and sustaining housing for people in particular circumstances, including mental health. So if I had some key messages or key, in short, some of the things we've talked through are that homelessness exists on a continuum. It's really complex, and the solutions are not any more simple than the complexity of the situation that people are in. Our investment of more than $1 million a year is very good. It's very successful. It is focused on that rough sleeper group or cohort of people. And we work really closely with central government and social service providers in our response, but there are gaps. We know that the work that we do to respond to homelessness is really important, although it is a difficult one to impact the measure, and that we're very keen to do some work, continue investing in the same way while we just review our approach and make sure that we are investing in the most appropriate way to achieve the best outcomes that we can. Now I'm going to have a sip of water and very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Kia ora, thank you. Yep, I'll check you on the list. All right. Councillor Winera.
Kia ora, thank you for that. It's a tough conversation, but exciting stuff. One thing that I did want to ask about was, I think it might have been the first or even second slide. It had a number of stages, if you like, of the progression of unhoused people to having permanent housing security. This one. So I noticed that at the far right, at the end of that progression, private ownership appears to be the goal. I feel as if that is maybe a red herring, and I think that housing security is not necessarily only found in private ownership of property, and I think indeed the ownership of property is not necessarily a goal for everyone. So is that kind of philosophy, does that overarch the whole strategy?
No. This is a housing continuum. It's used really, really widely. I think housing security is a great goal to have. There's some really interesting research. And there's been, in the past, there's been a lot of kind of expectation that people, for example, social housing in particular, when they move into social housing, it's a temporary thing, then you move into a private rental and so on. But actually, there is research, and we know, I think everybody knows that it's very unusual and it's very rare for people who move into social housing to move out of social housing. And there is work that we can do, and that when I worked in city housing, and I know that Te Toi Mahana will be doing the same thing, is around really supporting people to build community and for them to live in that housing until or if or when they are ready to move on. Murray talks about it beautifully as well, around people moving into all of their facilities, that for some people where they're at is where they stay, and that they will be there until they aren't. And there doesn't necessarily always need to be an expectation that people move through the stages.
Kia ora, David. I have a quick partai. So I know that there are a few different groups. So we've got like an interregional group that ELT used to sit on. We've got one that looks at case management with social workers. And I just wanted to get your idea, because I know that we also, under Tupiki Ora, the iwi and council, like the mayor and Nico, meet with them monthly, I think. So I just want to, how do we make sure that there is alignment across all these different quite high groups down to the ground level?
I think it's a really good question. It's challenging across lots of different things, including housing and homelessness. I think the vision that we had for Te Mahana in particular was, they had a very clear vision around ending rough sleeping, or ending homelessness, and then it subsequently down to rough sleeping, and having that goal and that vision, and as long as we're all working towards the same outcome, keeps everybody aligned. We are very well aligned across the region and with mana whenua on the outcome and the goal that everybody has in this work. So I don't think there is any risk of people at different levels heading off in completely different directions, because making sure that people have somewhere safe and warm and dry to live is a difficult goal to challenge.
Cool. Yeah. Recognising that we currently have a gap in the system for kaupapa Māori services, how will taking a review of Te Mahana and going into the future, how will that kind of fold in the promotion of more of those services, or how do we ensure that we've got mana whenua, like they would love to be driving it, Yeah,
we need to do some work to scope what that looks like. The work that we've done as part of the emergency housing system review shows that we're really well aligned, and that where mana whenua are very keen for us to go is the same place we want to. We do work really, really closely with Kahungunu whānau services. We've provided some funding to them for kind of ad hoc projects and initiatives, and we keep working with them, and we're very kind of closely, regularly in touch, I think.
Can I add to that? Sorry, Madam Chair.
Please.
Is through, as you all know, through the Tupiki Ora strategy and Takahere and Tupiki Ora strategy, we regularly meet in the iwi Leaders Forum, where we connect, make sure that we are in touch on issues such as housing developments and aspirations for our iwi when it comes to housing. So that is a constant conversation that we're having. And one of the first things that we did when we were invited, for example, to the MHUD, an example of that, as I should say, is one of the first things that we did when we were invited to Central Government Forum, is that we connected with our partners and coordinated an approach together that made sure that we lined up in our aspirations in that space.
Cool, thanks, Sahai. Councillor Paul.
Thanks, David. That's really good. It was good to hear, read the slides too. Some things I've learnt from talking to people who are rough sleeping is, one, it's hard to find accommodation when you're still consuming alcohol, so hopefully Te Pāmaru will help with that. But the other thing I hear about is often people have pets and they'd rather sleep rough than get rid of their pets. So is there like anything happening in that space to address that?
There's nothing specifically happening, but now you've prompted me. I think we do need to do some work on that. Kāinga Order a couple of years ago, changed their policy around pets, which has been really, really helpful. But for people who are rough sleeping and needing to move into emergency housing or transitional housing, that is problematic.
Yeah.
So it's very much a live issue around the multidisciplinary team table, that the group that Jo coordinates, and Jo's been supporting that group to find solutions, share solutions, and potentially develop them as well. So I don't know if you had any further comment, Jo.
The other thing is your team across the recent Waitangi Tribunal report that came out around Māori homelessness, and are you guys going to read through that and read the recommendations and all that stuff in there?
Yep, definitely. So we're definitely aware of it. It's a chunky piece of work, so not across all of the detail, but we need to make sure that we've factored that in and considered it. Another thing to probably acknowledge is, I'm interrupting a different question, going off on a tangent, but what I remember is that Loafers Lodge is a really good example of people who fall through the gaps. That building probably should, that accommodation facility probably should have counted as temporary or potentially even uninhabitable accommodation, in the sense of it not being somewhere for people to settle. But those people were considered in all of the statistics to be people who were adequately housed, and that is an area that we're going to have to consider as part of this work as well. While it popped in, I thought I would mention it.
That's really helpful, and because there's a whole section in the Housing Action Plan next week dedicated to homelessness, and I think it's really important that that's really strong because of Loafers Lodge happening so recently. So I think that's where we'll be looking to give more effect, particularly to getting a new plan in place. Sorry, my last question was just around rangatahi housing. So in Auckland, they've opened up some rangatahi housing, and I just wondered, is that a conversation we're having and progressing? And I also heard that KYS, based out in Kapiti, want to start some rangatahi housing, but they're interested in expanding in Wellington too. So is that something you guys can do, like go and have a chat with them and
definitely
do some of that down here?
Yep, definitely. We will have a chat with them. There are a couple of actions in the Children and Young People strategy around housing solutions for rangatahi, and we need to make sure that we're progressing with those. We do provide a small amount of funding to Evolve, who provide support for young people experiencing homelessness as well. But the direct provision of housing for homeless young people is challenging.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we have 7 people on the question list, so we'll just try and keep it snappy. I've got Councillor Chung.
Thanks very much for that. Do you find that there are people that, who don't engage with you at all, or do you find that you can actually speak to all of them?
We take different approaches to different people, and that involves working collaboratively through things like the multidisciplinary team to identify the most appropriate agency to seek to work with people. And we try and we try and we try. There are a small number of people who have made the decision for whatever reason to not engage with the council or with any agency, but we are all ready to work with that person as soon as they're in a place where they can do that.
You probably know the person I'm talking about, but I was walking with a friend down Lambton Quay, and there was this chap down there, and when we went past, it was in the evening, he said, he hasn't eaten all day. And so the friend I was with said, well,
Councillor
no, we can't leave him. So we went back and got him a...
Councillor Chung, sorry, I'm just going to have to limit it to questions. If you can reframe it into a question.
I'm not sure. I can't figure out whether they're hungry or whether they need a home, and so I found it very difficult to actually engage with them to find out what it was that he wanted.
I don't know the specific person, and it wouldn't be appropriate to get into particular scenarios, but what I would say is that is likely, if there is a person like that, that there are multiple and really complex challenges, and it's very likely that they're being well supported by a social service agency in the city. And then it's, the generosity of Wellingtonians is what drives some of that behaviour. I think it's wonderful to acknowledge a person and to say hello and to treat them in a mana-enhancing way. But if you were feeling generous, I would encourage you to direct your funds or your resources to organisations who provide direct support rather than to individuals.
There's really strong guidance and a lot of resources about that through the DCM website. Yep, you're on the list. I've got Councillor McNulty next.
Hey, just a quick one. If your budget, let's say it was doubled overnight, what would you do differently, or what would you do more of that you're not doing now?
That's a really good question. I think, and I'll get the team to jump in and help me with this one. We would immediately focus and invest more in Māori housing outcomes, knowing that Māori are disproportionately affected, and we would need to have a think about how that works. But those gaps that we've identified is where we would need to invest that money in women, in Māori, and in young people, and in pets. Anything?
Kua mutu, finished, Ben?
Yep, that's me.
Awesome. Got Councillor Free.
Thank you. And actually, this touches on the matter that was raised prior to this last question. Just on not donating directly, people do find that hard because it tugs at the heartstrings. What can we do to make it more obvious to the public the range of services that we're actually involved in partnering with and funding, and how they can contribute to those directly and support them?
We do that. We do that now, and we will continue to promote and advocate for those services. Ultimately, we can't direct people on where they spend their money or what they choose to do. But we will continue to encourage people to invest in services and agencies.
I wonder if we could do a wee bit more, because this is like for example Kilburnie, the retailers really don't want people sitting there begging. If people sit there and beg and don't get anything because people are directing their money to these services, then that actually lessens the problem for the retailers. Is there some synergy there where retailers could actually be given a little list of, if you want to help the people who are needy?
Am I able to?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Is there something more we can do?
If I can jump in there, through the Whanake Promise, we've been working with DCM on their campaign to educate people on how to support our vulnerable community on the street. So there's a range of different posters and materials that we hand out to retailers and hospitality.
Great.
So they can put up and educate patrons coming in to say this is the best way for.
Yeah, because everyone wants to do the right thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we noticed that, and that's something. If you in the briefing that we gave you through Whanake Promise, there's a little example there of that campaign in there.
Okay,
Totally.
I'd really like to talk more about this and even see if there's something we can do in my local area, because it is a bit of a problem.
We'll come back to you with a summary of what we're doing in that space.
Awesome. Okay, now I can't remember who put up their name. Was it Panet or Calvert? One of you had your hand up. You? Yeah. No? Okay, it must have been Panet.
Thank you for your important mahi on this work. I do find the wording harm reduction sanitising, I think I mentioned it to you. Are we able to look at that overall as an organisation? I just don't think it captures what we're really talking about. Okay.
Yeah, noted.
Okay, and the definition of homelessness, look, I can see why you've gone simpler, but we used to have primary, secondary, tertiary. Was there any reason why we moved away from that?
I am not aware of that. The definition we use is very comprehensive. It's very comprehensive and is aligned to the housing continuum. But I can't comment on how we used to do it.
Yeah, okay. I just wondered if there was a reason. Look, sorry if I missed it, but the rainbow community, what's going to be the overall response? Because there's clearly a major issue there, and Tam's already raised around rangatahi, so that will cover some of it.
we need to do some work. It's an obvious gap in the current provision of housing.
Okay, we can talk to Trek about that. And just the other thing, I just wanted to break down the male homelessness versus female homelessness. Now, I know you say that women do have problems, because I would have expected women to actually have more problems, because, you know, they end up worse off after divorce or don't have as much money. So can you just talk a little bit more about the struggles there?
Our estimate is that, you know, it's much closer to 50-50 than the data we have shows. But because our investment has really focused, and our data collection has really focused on rough sleeping, where women are much more likely to be couch surfing or feeling like they have no other options than to, you know, stay temporarily with different people. So the challenges, yes. Yeah, and whether those are healthy relationships or not, that's a really complex issue, and it isn't captured in the rough sleeper information. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Councillor Panic. Great partai. Councillor Abdurrahman.
Thank you, David. My question would be, even amongst the most vulnerable, there are others who are again at the bottom of it, the unreachable, the one that they don't even come ask for help. Is there a way, they're also isolated in a lot of ways, how that approach, because some of the agencies that we currently have working with them, maybe also, you know, can't even reach them. What is the approach of the council to work with these communities, and the communities, also emerging communities, and what would you guys do?
We work really closely with all sorts of agencies on all sorts of things, and a social service provider is not necessarily the best person to connect with a particular community, and we've seen that through Loafers Lodge as a really good example, and one of the outcomes of that will be rebuilding our local welfare group and making sure that we're really closely connected with agencies who work with the spectrum of different communities that we have in Wellington, and making sure that we're well connected in an emergency, but having those relationships means that we can leverage them, and that we can use those relationships for other things. For example, if we're dealing with a significant, I shouldn't say significant, with a challenging person in Kilburnie, and we're working with the mosque in Kilburnie, who wouldn't usually be involved in homelessness, but because they have a connection with the person, they're able to support the overall response. So we try to connect with the most appropriate group, whoever that might be. But there are absolutely, you know, people that nobody is in contact with, that nobody can reach at the moment, and all we can do is continue to encourage them to engage with us. Yeah.
My partai would be, the data doesn't say anything about the new migrant or the refugees or the ethnic community. Is that because we don't have a recording system, or none of them are homeless? They are not in...
The transition points in people's lives is a really key opportunity for people to experience homelessness, and transitioning from one country to another, is, you know, in particular as a refugee, is an opportunity where that can happen. The number of migrants, there are a number of homeless migrants and former refugees, and I haven't highlighted them in the slide, but they are there, and we're aware of many of them.
Cool. We've got Councillor Foon, then Councillor Randall, and if we could limit to short questions, just because we only have a few minutes left.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Abdurrahman. And I think through Loafers, that was a shock to me that we had, not communities I didn't expect to see. So it would be good if we could actually, can we have a place for them to be represented, so that our wider community understands that as well?
Absolutely.
My question is around the social services and funding for them, and particularly competition around funding, and probably you're more connected to them. Is that a
is that a rumour, or is that a challenge that our NGOs are facing, as well as being limited in resource to respond?
That is not a rumour. That is
Yep.
is correct in a
It was,
nutshell.
yeah.
And our current funding mechanisms supports that as well, and enables that approach. And that's one of when I moved into this role, the Social Recreation Fund, which is how we invest in most of the social outcomes that we achieve, create some of those issues, and we do need to really spend a little bit of time and really consider that and how we can make sure that we support the best outcomes in the most appropriate way.
Yeah, and so will that be a bit of a snapshot in the review as well, and understanding how government funds, and I think
we need to
a bit of a holistic view of that.
In the grand scheme of things, the money that we have, it's huge for us, but compared to government funding, it's nothing, and we need to consider how we can have the biggest impact with the limited resourcing that we have.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Randall, lucky last.
Thank you, and thank you, our fellow councillors. It's easy to say when something is complex, but thank you for giving some background detail just how complex it is. It seems to me that homelessness seems to be a bit like cancer. I mean, there's a whole lot of different reasons, but we're just seeing the outcome. My questions are really, I've got 3 questions, but I think they're related. One is really around mental health to a certain extent, but how much of this is about people who are chronically unable to get permanent, or semi-permanent residency, and so we're really taking care of them in this situation where they are and trying to give them opportunities, but limited success. How much is the mental health engagement and support, treatment support for people who are in this space? How much is a role for us to do? And lastly, in terms of balanced resources, how much of your efforts going towards getting people into emergency housing versus getting them out of emergency housing?
Those are all very good, very complex and very intertwined questions. Mental health is a huge challenge. Mental health and addiction are significant problems, and they're significant contributors to people's ability to enter and to sustain housing. And we are working. We had a really productive hui recently with MHAIDS, who are part of Te Whatu Order, around their desire to work much more closely with us and with communities to achieve improved outcomes. And we really highlighted, as part of that conversation, the impact that poor mental health outcomes have on homelessness. Our role in kind of moving people into emergency housing or moving people into permanent housing, we work very closely with agencies on all of those things. The council itself is a significant provider of permanent housing, and the homes that we have are really kind of given to people who are most in need, which is primarily people who are experiencing homelessness. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, cool.
Ngā mihi nui, a huge thank you to David, Amy and Joe. I think it's clear from all of our questions today the high level of interest in this topic. And yeah, just to acknowledge that it's clearly due for a bit of a review, and we'll be excited and awaiting that across the city. But thank you all for coming in to talk to us today, and for coming in early as well.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. Yeah.